Marcus Williams had everything money could buy. At 38, his real estate empire was worth $200 million. He drove a Bentley, lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, dated models and actresses. But that Tuesday in September, walking through the streets of Brooklyn Heights in a $3,000 suit, he felt emptier than ever. He'd just left another charity gala where everyone praised him for his wallet, not for who he was. He was heading to his car when he saw a young woman struggling with 4 heavy grocery bags. The plastic tore, apples rolled into the street. She fell to her knees, trying to gather everything while tears streamed down her face. Marcus could have simply walked past. But something, maybe exhaustion from a life of superficiality, made him stop. He took off his jacket, laid it on the hood of his Bentley, and knelt beside her to help. He didn't know that this woman with dirt-stained hands and eyes full of wounded dignity was named Sarah Martinez, and he didn't know that this simple act of kindness would forever change his life, teaching him that true love isn't bought with money, but built through gestures no one sees. New York City gleamed under the September sun when Marcus Williams stepped out of the Michelin-starred restaurant Per Se after yet another charity dinner. He'd just written a $50,000 check for an organization that would probably use $40,000 for administrative expenses. Everyone had thanked him with plastic smiles, but no one had really looked him in the eye. At 38, Marcus Williams was one of the wealthiest men in New York. His real estate group, Williams Holdings, owned luxury properties in 6 countries. He was handsome, successful, always photographed with stunning women on his arm. Gossip magazines called him New York's last eligible bachelor. But that evening, as he walked the cobblestone streets of Brooklyn Heights toward his parked Bentley, Marcus felt profoundly alone. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit from Tom Ford, gleaming Oxford shoes, a Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, every detail perfect, every inch refined. But beneath that external perfection was a man tired of superficial relationships, of women interested only in his bank account, of friendships built on opportunism. He was almost at his car when he saw her, a young woman, probably around 27, struggling with 4 heavy grocery bags while trying to open the door of an apartment building. She wore worn jeans, a simple t-shirt, threadbare sneakers. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her makeup-free face showing the exhaustion of a long day. Marcus watched her for a moment, noticing how she tried to maintain balance as the bags cut into her fingers. He was about to walk past. It wasn't his business, after all, when it happened. One of the plastic bags suddenly tore. Apples, tomatoes, a bottle of milk. Everything rolled into the street in different directions. The woman let out a cry of frustration and fell to her knees, desperately trying to gather the groceries while milk spilled onto the cobblestones. Tears began streaming down her face, not just from ruined groceries, but from something deeper, the exhaustion of someone fighting every day just to survive. Marcus stopped. Something about that scene struck his heart. Maybe it was the dignity with which she tried not to cry out loud. Maybe it was the contrast between her genuine tears and the fake smiles he'd seen all evening. Or maybe it was simply that, after years of living in a golden bubble, he'd forgotten what real life was like. Without thinking too much, Marcus took off his $3,000 jacket and laid it on the gleaming hood of his Bentley. He approached the woman and knelt beside her, starting to pick up tomatoes that had rolled under a parked car. Sarah, though Marcus didn't know her name yet, looked up in surprise. She saw an impeccably dressed man, clearly wealthy, judging by his watch and perfect shirt, kneeling in the street, smiling kindly at her while retrieving her tomatoes. For a moment, embarrassment paralyzed her. She was used to managing on her own, not asking anyone for help. But then she saw something in this stranger's eyes. Not pity, not superiority, but a simple and spontaneous kindness she hadn't seen in years. Marcus collected everything he could save and put it in the intact bags. The milk was lost, but the rest could be salvaged. He took off his silk tie and used it to improvise a knot to hold together one of the torn bags. When Sarah saw the probably expensive tie being used as string for groceries, she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. In the end, she laughed, a genuine laugh that lit up her tired face. Marcus stood and extended his hand to help her up. She hesitated, then took it. Her hand was rough, marked by work, so different from the soft, manicured hands of the women he usually dated. They looked at each other for a moment. Sarah noticed he was incredibly attractive, but not in the polished way of men she saw on television. There was something real in his eyes, a melancholy she recognized because it was similar to her own. Marcus noticed she was beautiful, but not in the artificial way he was used to. It was natural beauty, unadorned, with small imperfections that made her even more fascinating. Sarah broke the silence by thanking him with a still trembling voice. Marcus smiled and said it was nothing. Anyone would have done it, but they both knew that wasn't true. He'd walked these elegant streets enough times to see people in difficulty ignored by everyone. Marcus took the two heaviest bags and asked where she lived. Sarah hesitated. She didn't know this man, but looking into his eyes, she felt she could trust him. She pointed to the door next to them. She lived on the 4th floor, no elevator. Marcus took the bags and started climbing the stairs without saying anything. Sarah followed him, still in a slight state of shock. The elegant stranger was climbing the stairs of her working-class building as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Arriving at the 4th floor, Sarah opened the door to a small studio apartment. It was tiny, but spotlessly clean, carefully organized, full of books and plants. Marcus set the bags on the small kitchen table and finally introduced himself. Sarah was speechless when she realized who was standing in front of her. Marcus Williams. The Marcus Williams she saw in newspapers, at charity events, in society pages. The most desired multimillionaire in New York. And he was there, in her 400-square-foot studio, with his shirt dirty from soil and his tie transformed into grocery string. Embarrassment overwhelmed her. The difference between their worlds was so enormous, it seemed ridiculous. She was a simple elementary school teacher who barely made ends meet. He was him. But Marcus didn't seem uncomfortable at all. He looked around the apartment with genuine curiosity, noticing poetry books on shelves, children's drawings attached to the fridge, plants lovingly tended on the windowsill. When Sarah timidly offered him coffee, Marcus accepted with a smile that warmed her heart. It wasn't the polite smile he probably used at important dinners. It was a real smile, as if he were sincerely happy to be there. While Sarah prepared coffee in her small kitchen, Marcus looked around with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The apartment was small, but it had soul. Every object told a story. The worn books had been truly read, not bought for decoration. The photos on the mantel showed real people, authentic smiles, not studied poses. Sarah served him coffee in a simple cup and sat across from him at the small table. The initial silence was awkward, but not unpleasant. Marcus broke the ice by asking what she did for a living. When Sarah answered that she taught at Renaissance Elementary School in the Bronx, Marcus saw her eyes light up. She spoke passionately about her kids, many of whom came from difficult families. She told how she tried to give them not just education, but hope, how every small progress of a child was a victory for her. Her voice trembled slightly, talking about Omar, a Syrian refugee child who'd started the year without speaking a word of English, and now read stories aloud to the class. Marcus listened, enchanted. When was the last time someone had spoken to him with such passion about something other than money or success? When was the last time he'd had a real conversation? Sarah apologized for getting carried away, saying it was probably boring. But Marcus shook his head intently. It was the most interesting conversation he'd had in months. He asked why she shopped in this neighborhood if she taught in the Bronx. Sarah explained she lived there because it was the only rent she could afford on a precarious teacher's salary. She worked on renewable annual contracts, without security. with a salary that barely covered rent, expenses, and the minimum to live. The reality of those words hit Marcus. He spent on one dinner what she earned in a month. Yet she was happy, or at least happier than him, because she did something she loved that gave meaning to her life. They talked for hours. Sarah told about her family in Texas, retired parents who sacrificed to help her, how she'd come to New York 5 years earlier with the dream of making a difference. Marcus shared, which he almost never did, about his childhood, about an entrepreneur father who'd pushed him to build an empire but died before seeing it realized, about how he felt trapped in a successful life that left him empty. When Marcus finally looked at his watch, it was 11 at night. He'd been sitting there for almost 4 hours. He couldn't remember a time when he'd been so comfortable with someone. He stood up, apologizing for taking so much time. But Sarah stopped him with a hand on his arm. Her eyes were sincere when she said it had been the best evening she'd had in months. No one ever really talked to her. Everyone was too caught up in their own lives. Marcus hesitated at the threshold. He wanted to see her again, but how do you ask someone out when you live in such different universes? Finally, with a sincerity that surprised him, he simply asked if they could have coffee again. Not somewhere fancy, just coffee. Sarah smiled and said yes. They exchanged numbers. Marcus descended the stairs with his heart lighter than it had been in years. His Bentley was still there, with his jacket laid on the hood, but for the first time in his life, the $300,000 car seemed tremendously unimportant. In the following weeks, Marcus and Sarah began seeing each other regularly. Marcus discovered a side of New York he'd never known. Walks in Prospect Park without bodyguards, dinners in small neighborhood diners where no one recognized him, afternoons reading poetry in Sarah's small apartment while rain beat against the windows. Sarah brought him into her world of simple but precious things. She took him to meet her kids at school. Marcus spent an afternoon reading stories and was amazed at how rewarding it was to see their eyes light up. She took him to the Sunday farmers market in Union Square, where she bargained over prices and laughed with vendors who knew her by name. For the first time in years, Marcus felt alive. With Sarah, he didn't have to impress anyone, didn't have to be the successful multimillionaire. He could simply be Marcus, with his doubts, his fears, his dreams. But their different worlds soon began creating tensions. One day, a colleague of Marcus's saw him leaving the school where Sarah taught. Photos ended up in gossip publications. The Mogul and the Teacher, New Flame for Williams, headlined the paper with photos of Sarah looking uncomfortable in front of cameras. Sarah was overwhelmed by unwanted attention.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Journalists waiting outside school, colleagues looking at her with envy or suspicion, parents asking embarrassing questions. The principal called her in, concerned about the school's image. Marcus tried to protect her, but every gesture seemed to make things worse. When he sent a lawyer to block paparazzi, papers wrote he was possessive. When he invited her to an important dinner, Sarah felt completely out of place among women in $10,000 dresses who looked down on her. The breaking point came when Marcus's mother, Catherine Williams, requested to meet Sarah. The meeting was at an elegant midtown hotel. Catherine was a 60-year-old woman, elegant and cold as a diamond. She looked Sarah up and down with an expression that said everything. She asked politely but icily about her family, her education, her career prospects. Every question was a subtle way to emphasize the class difference. Finally, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, Catherine said clearly that her son needed a woman suitable to his social status, someone who understood the business world, someone who could stand beside him at charity galas and dinners with investors, not a simple elementary teacher with a rented apartment. Sarah left that meeting feeling small and inadequate. Marcus found her crying on a park bench. When he understood what had happened, he was furious with his mother. but the damage was done. That evening, in her small apartment, Sarah said to Marcus what they both knew, but no one wanted to admit. They lived in worlds too different. She couldn't live in the spotlight, judged and found inadequate. And he couldn't give up his life, his family, his empire. Marcus protested. He said he loved her, that he'd give up everything for her. But Sarah, with tears streaming down her face, replied that precisely because she loved him, she couldn't let him do it. She knew men who'd given up their lives for love and then spent the rest of their days regretting what they'd lost. They kissed for the last time that evening. Then Sarah closed the door, leaving Marcus on the landing with a broken heart. Marcus returned to his old life, but everything had changed. Elegant dinners were unbearably superficial. Beautiful women seeking his attention seemed empty. His penthouse with breathtaking views of Central Park was a gilded prison. He tried to throw himself into work, to forget, but every corner of New York reminded him of Sarah. The park where they'd walked, holding hands. The small bookstore where she bought used books for her students. The diner where they'd shared a plate of pasta for hours, talking about everything and nothing. His mother tried to set him up with suitable girls, heiresses, successful managers, daughters of entrepreneurs. But Marcus sent them away after 5 minutes. None of them had Sarah's look, her genuine laugh, her passion for things that truly mattered. 3 months passed. Marcus became a worse version of himself, bitter, cynical, even lonelier than before. His assistant noticed he no longer smiled, that he stared into space during meetings, that he'd lost interest in everything. One evening, while driving aimlessly through the city, he found himself in front of the school where Sarah taught. It was late, but he saw light in one of the classrooms. He approached the window and saw her. Sarah was alone, sitting at her desk, surrounded by notebooks to grade. But she wasn't grading. She was crying silently, her face in her hands. Marcus understood she was suffering as much as he was. In that moment, something clicked in Marcus. All his life he'd built empires, made million-dollar deals, overcome impossible obstacles. But facing the only thing that truly mattered, love, he'd surrendered at the first difficulty. His mother was right about one thing. Sarah didn't belong to his world. But maybe the problem wasn't her. Maybe it was his world that needed to change. That night, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't give up Sarah, and he wouldn't ask her to give up herself. He would build a bridge between their two worlds. Marcus began implementing a plan he'd developed during sleepless nights. He called his most trusted colleagues and announced something that left them speechless. Williams Holdings would create a foundation dedicated to education in underserved neighborhoods. It wouldn't be one of the usual facade foundations created for tax benefits. It would be real, concrete, with Marcus personally involved. The goal? Provide resources, materials, support to public schools in New York's outer boroughs. But there was more. Marcus announced he'd drastically reduce his personal lifestyle. The $10 million penthouse? Sold. Profits would go to the foundation. The Bentley and other luxury cars? Gone. He'd keep just one normal car. Dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants? Over. Money saved would go to children who needed it. His board of directors thought he'd gone crazy. His mother accused him of throwing everything away for an ordinary girl. Papers wrote he was having an existential crisis. But Marcus didn't waver. For the first time in years, he knew exactly what he was doing and why. He wasn't doing it to impress Sarah. He was doing it because she'd taught him something fundamental, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the impact you have on others' lives. The Williams Education Foundation opened 3 months later. Marcus chose as the first school to help the very one where Sarah taught. He arrived one day without warning, not in the Bentley, but in a van full of books, computers, teaching materials. Sarah was in class when the principal called her. When she came down and saw Marcus, her heart stopped. He'd changed. He seemed lighter, happier, more real. Marcus explained everything: the foundation, his new projects, how he wanted to dedicate his life to making a difference, as she did every day. He didn't ask for anything in return, didn't ask her to come back to him. He just told her she'd been right. Their worlds were too different, so he'd changed his. Sarah cried, but this time they were tears of joy. Not for the money or computers, though those would help her kids tremendously, but because she finally saw the man hiding beneath the multimillionaire. She saw the Marcus she'd glimpsed that first evening when he'd knelt in the street to help her with groceries. In the following months, Marcus and Sarah slowly began again. But this time, it was different. Marcus spent his days not in business meetings, but visiting schools, talking with teachers, understanding real problems. He learned that a ream of paper or a set of new markers could make a child's eyes shine more than any expensive gift. Marcus's mother took time to accept it, but she gradually changed too. When she saw the real impact the foundation was having, children improving in school, families receiving support, neighborhoods being revitalized, she understood her son hadn't thrown anything away. He'd found something far more precious than money. 2 years after that first street encounter, Marcus and Sarah got married. It wasn't the wedding Marcus's mother had always imagined for her multimillionaire son. There weren't 500 guests, no Renaissance castle rented for the occasion, no orchids imported from the Philippines. They married in the small church in the Bronx neighborhood, the one near the school where Sarah taught. Guests were an incredible mix, from Marcus's old entrepreneur colleagues to parents of Sarah's students, from Williams Holdings employees to Union Square market vendors who'd known Sarah for years. Sarah wore a simple but beautiful dress she'd chosen with her mother. No famous designers, no diamonds. But when Marcus saw her walking toward him down the aisle, he thought she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. During the ceremony, Marcus spoke words from his heart. He said that for 38 years, he'd believed success was measured in money and power. But Sarah had taught him that true success is waking up every morning with purpose, making a difference in someone's life, loving and being loved for who you really are, not what you own. Sarah, with tears streaming down her face, said Marcus had taught her, "You don't have to give up your dreams for love. That true love doesn't ask for impossible sacrifices, but inspires both people to become better versions of themselves." The reception was at a simple neighborhood restaurant. No $1,000 champagne, but genuine beer. No caviar, but homemade lasagna from one of her students' grandmother. And it was the best party most guests had ever attended, because it was authentic. During the celebration, one of Sarah's students, young Omar, who now spoke perfect English, read a poem he'd written for his favorite teachers. It spoke of how love was like a bridge connecting two different shores, allowing people to cross and discover new worlds. Marcus and Sarah moved into a normal apartment in Sarah's neighborhood. Marcus still had his company, but now managed it differently. Half the profits went to the foundation. He'd hired people who shared his new vision. That business could be a force for good. The Williams Education Foundation had grown, now supporting 50 schools across America. Marcus had discovered that convincing an investor to finance an educational project gave him 1,000 times more satisfaction than closing a $1 million real estate deal. Sarah continued teaching, but now had resources to do much more. Together with Marcus, they'd created after-school programs, scholarships, support for struggling families. 5 years after their wedding, Marcus and Sarah were walking the same Brooklyn Heights streets where they'd met. They passed the exact spot where Sarah had dropped her groceries. Marcus stopped and smiled. He said every time he passed there, he thanked heaven that grocery bag had torn. Sarah laughed and kissed him, saying she too thanked heaven that an elegant millionaire had stopped to help a girl with dirt-stained hands. They walked hand in hand, no longer two people from different worlds, but two people who'd built a new world together. A world where money was a tool for good, where love was stronger than class differences, where the kindness of a single gesture could change two lives forever. That evening, returning home to their normal apartment in a normal neighborhood, Marcus thought about how his life had changed. He had less money in the bank, a cheaper car, a smaller house. But he had something all his money could never buy. He was truly happy. And as Sarah fell asleep in his arms, Marcus whispered a silent thank you to life. Because it had taught him, through an extraordinary woman with 4 grocery bags too heavy to carry, that true love can't be bought. It's earned, one kind gesture at a time. Like if you believe true love overcomes every difference. Comment sharing an act of kindness that changed your life. Share this story of how simplicity beats luxury when there's real love. Subscribe for more stories, reminding you what truly matters in life. Sometimes the most precious things in life come when you stop to help someone. And sometimes, in a simple act of kindness, lies the love of a lifetime. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank. What matters is how many people love you for who you really are, not for what you own.